Having a child, with the enormous risk of him having other descendants and growing the next generations, brings with it a huge amount of suffering, both potential and certainly realized. The negative utilitarian approach presupposes that choosing less suffering or causing less suffering to prevent more suffering is the right choice. If harming a present living being is the solution to preventing greater future harm from existing, doing so is justified upon making the assumptions presented. The statement about pushing a pregnant woman downstairs should be interpreted that way. I argue that it should be interpreted theoretically as preventing more suffering. However, it should be clearly stated that I completely dissociate myself from any actual implementation of a solution that is not presented here as a thought experiment, but offers the possibility of literally taking such a solution as practical. It should be especially noted that I do not consider doing the harm described in this way, and in addition acting against the law, as ethically profitable. I believe that it does not help reduce suffering, and does not lead to the desired goal. I am totally opposed to harming people on the pretext of effilism on my own. I believe that as individuals we have too little data to be able to assess the real impact of the harm caused, especially on the scale of the social realm. Even if harming a pregnant woman would render thousands of future people non-existent and reduce the suffering of millions of harmed beings, including tortured animals, doing it on your own and in a bestial way, conceivable as sadistic, would reduce the popularity of the very idea of effilism and negative utilitarianism, the effects of which, I believe, would eventually limit the possibility of reducing suffering, so I consider the solution presented in the quotation to be ineffective. A similar situation occurs in the next quote, concerning the killing of a pregnant woman if she refuses an abortion, which would be sanctioned on the basis of a signed contract. From the point of view of negative utilitarianism, provided that we assume that death does not harm the dying person, because it does not cause suffering if the death is painless both physically and mentally, this solution does not seem to be problematic in theory either. The death of the future mother is the last resort agreed with both parties. In such a case, death would have to be inflicted painlessly and carried out by qualified personnel. However, such a solution requires a profound change in the mentality of society, which is not achievable on timescales closest to our thinking. I do not believe that such a solution will ever be introduced, as with the development of technology, we will probably reach transhumanism relatively sooner. Improving people's intellectual abilities has the potential to exclude or minimize irrational behavior, including the desire to have children if the desire is indeed irrational. I currently see the practical introduction of this type of prohibition and contract as an ineffective action that would cause social rebellion and hinder the minimization of suffering in the long term. I also completely condemn the vulgar and disrespectful vocabulary used in the quoted passages. I find its use reckless and irresponsible, as well as possibly indicating a tendency to dehumanize mothers. I am unfamiliar with any form of hatred of people with any behavior. Condemnation of an act does not mean condemnation of a person. Only by striving for mutual respect and understanding can we reach an agreement. Moreover, it must be said that the way the views presented in the quotations alone are presented is false. Gary claims he would push any woman he gets pregnant down the stair. Not true. Only woman who refuses to get an abortion. It is false to say that pregnancy itself is a ground for violating freedom. The statement in the title is a dishonest representation. I trust in good faith, as the practical content of the quotes is shocking and irresponsible. I clearly dissociate myself from such practical postulates. I completely cut myself off from this misanthropic and misogynistic approach. It's in no way fun. Even if it were ultimately ethically viable, which is, by social and mimetic influence, highly questionable, it would be an extremely ineffective course of action. I understand where this hatred comes from, namely from being aware of the future suffering caused by procreation. However, I find it extremely irresponsible not to control one's anger, and I denounce any satisfaction in any suffering. I don't see any reason to hate anyone. Acting against certain types of behavior, such as rape, need not and should not involve hatred of the wrongdoers. The fact is that many people, including those who participate in our immediate life and family members, are responsible for creating huge suffering in a more or less indirect way. Certainly, people involved in harming animals do more harm than certain rapists, which is by no means an excuse for rape in any form. I am convinced that the presented interpretation of the message is correct and unproblematic. It is also not a justification for rape of any kind. Gary does not state the frequency with which rapists of the described semi-benign type occur, which is not incompatible with the claim that there is a meager fraction. If someone interprets a quote as encouraging or advocating rape, they are clearly mistaken and grossly misinterpreting. Both I and other efilists who deem themselves to be rational unanimously condemn any form of rape, any form of abuse of anyone for their own pleasure, and any unnecessary implication of suffering of any kind. Is it justifiable to rape and torture a woman for months so that she doesn't give birth to 12 children? The situation described here is not as controversial in itself if you treat it as a thought experiment. Similar to the comment under the first set of quotations, from the standpoint of negative utilitarianism, such behavior would be morally permissible if it prevented more suffering. The 12 children, whose rise will most likely result in hundreds of thousands more people in the distant future, can and very possibly will cause an amount of suffering far beyond the unimaginable suffering of rape and torture. This in no way makes torture and rape something advisable or good in itself. And the situation in the quote itself, which could be interpreted as a thought experiment, is in my opinion, however, profitable only in very abstract, hypothetical situations, including, but not limited to, virtual realities and distorted experiments to be considered seriously in any way. Keeping suffering to a minimum, not merely reducing suffering, is what is essential, and the method presented is extremely ineffective, as well as would be unimaginably harmful for social and mimetic reasons if it were ever done by some madman. Here is the problem with the quotation presented, as the structure of the statement does not clearly indicate a thought experiment, but rather a quasi-practical solution, impossible or impractical due to the existence of the imprisonment sentence. I appeal to every efilist and every person who is willing to contemplate such ill-considered and uncertain consequences of inflicting such terrible violence on any creature to abandon considering such solutions other than for the purposes of thought experiments. Sadistic misanthropy resulting from an anger-filled reaction to people who indirectly cause suffering is extremely dangerous and irresponsible, and certainly unworthy of those who have minimized suffering as their goal. I completely dissociate myself from any promotion of unnecessary practical violence, and I do not think that torture, especially when it comes to a barbaric example, has ever been an effective solution. Gary is terribly wrong to say that it would be a right thing, and from his other statements and general views, it appears that he underestimates the long-term and indirect consequences of such acts. The awareness of the unprofitability of the presented solutions should be the core of the practical, rational approach of the efilists. Misogyny is by no means part of the philosophy underlying efilism, and I am very sad that its greatest advocate presents misogynistic tendencies. I am unfamiliar with any form of hatred towards women, and towards any other social group. I understand associating women also with reproduction and the maternal instinct, but creating a negative image of women on this basis is a mistake. The quotation expresses an opinion and not a philosophical approach, which excludes the quotation from the possibility of rational attempts to place it in the efilist theory. Inmendham's view is not a reason to reject efilism, and the irrationality and harmfulness of misogyny in itself require that such an emotional and hateful attitude be rejected. The mere assumption of negative utilitarianism, with the assumption that death is not a harm, entitles us to make such a statement if we have enough data to determine what action will minimize the amount of suffering. Wild cats cause and experience enormous amounts of suffering by killing tens of thousands of smaller animals, as well as getting sick, traumatized, and dying painful deaths. From the perspective of the version of NU presented here, for cats themselves, their trapping and painlessly putting to sleep is a completely rational action that minimizes their suffering. The problem arises after considering the dependencies in the environment in which wild cats live. They are predators that limit, often significantly, the number of many species of birds and rodents. By preventing populations of smaller animals from growing, their lives can ultimately stop the suffering of countless smaller organisms, so it may not be profitable to catch and put to sleep wild cats. Depending on how we treat the possible suffering of insects that are eaten by birds, the situation may turn out to be even more complicated. I do not know if we currently have sufficient knowledge to determine whether putting wild cats to sleep is ethically profitable for their environment. The controversy of the quote, however, lies in killing healthy animals, because of the common assumption that it is clearly wrong. I do not agree with this assumption. The humane ending of a healthy animal's life is not bad for a dying animal. As with the termination of existence, there are terminated also preferences, i.e. the preference for life. If putting feral cats and other animals to sleep do not increase the overall amount of suffering in the ecosystem, it should be implemented. What can be the case with cats, and probably most other species, is that their ethical influences are undetermined due to the lack of research. For the time being trapping and killing them, especially if it prevents their reproduction, can be viewed as a desirable option, but it is in my opinion highly uncertain. This argument is similar to the previous one. In fact, it is less controversial as it concerns not only wild cats, but also domestic animals, for which the network of dependencies is less complex. House cats, apart from influencing populations of smaller animals, but to a lesser extent, have no other possibility of having a positive impact on reducing suffering, apart from the psychological, but questionable in the long run aspect of their life with humans. For this reason, unless there is obvious suffering to other beings from a painless killing of a cat, I see no contraindication to doing so. On the contrary, hastening imminent death is a salvation from the strivings, desires, and sufferings that the animal would otherwise have to feel, and its life would probably end painfully, possibly preceded by a painful and lengthy process of illness or injury. Due to the obvious psychological impact of causing death, the decision to take such a step should, however, be well thought out so as not to cause mental disorders or other problems of a similar nature. It should be also obvious death should ideally be brought by qualified personnel. I agree that I am not convinced by any argument that a painless and unconscious death is bad. In light of the above comment, I agree that if a cat or any other animal does not need to exist to reduce suffering, it is rational to end its life painlessly, not ignoring all its effects on the human psyche, surroundings, society, and the environment. For the cat itself, however, an unconscious and painless death cannot be suffering. I hold the same view described above. My main objection is also described cats seem to reduce the population of smaller animals. Also, practical aspects of large-scale projects, such as putting to sleep without pain and trapping with as little suffering as possible, are very important if it is decided to eliminate a population. Gary loudly says that drowning kittens is horrible. The statement "it is good to drown kittens" is in an obvious way false. Suffocation and other forms of suffering dying animals have to deal with are great, yet any rational person has to be aware of other horrible things that will be experienced by them if they continue to exist. In the end, death, possibly more horrible than relatively quick drowning, will be their fate. All this apart from the most important, potentially huge number of new lives that they will have to initiate. Drowning kittens is not good, it is causing suffering, but not killing them is allowing more suffering to exist, so it is even worse. The best solution would be to put the kittens to sleep painlessly, but in the presented situation, drowning them, despite its horror, is less bad than the alternative. When considering this argument, it is important to restrain the indignation and other emotions associated with a mentality so controversial to psychological comfort and also a legal status as well social and mimetic impact. This statement is about belief. An efilist need not have a basis for theoretically preferring one option over the other, although there are grounds for both. The fact is that potential sterilization of all life, if feasible at all, would require an enormous amount of resources and technology that may not be sufficient even at its peak, or at least less effective than extermination. It may be true that devising a way to kill a life with less suffering will ultimately result in more, although my personal inclination is not to that conclusion. I believe that an effective, relatively painless extermination of earthly life is feasible with sufficiently advanced technology. It is important that this is not an uncertain atomic apocalypse, but a precisely calculated process. The matter of life in space is also important, but it is not directly related to the topic. To consider extermination with as little suffering as possible as a more practical vision of ending earthly suffering is justified not only by practical technological limitations but also for theoretical reasons, being a route that ultimately causes less suffering,